Hello, today we are going to look at the new Bible in Pictures for Little Eyes by Kenneth N. Illustrated by Annabelle Spenceley. I will put a link in the description where you can look at or purchase this book. And if you missed my videos introducing the topic of Bible storybooks and want to know more about the rubric I'm working from, you can start with this video or check the description for more links. This is a new 2002 edition of an old book, The Bible in Pictures for Little Eyes by Kenneth N. The first edition of this book was published in 1956 and illustrated by someone who is uncredited, perhaps someone on staff with Moody Press at the time. Aside from the pictures and the addition of short prayers, it seems like not a lot has changed since this book's first publication. So a lot of what we'll talk about today can apply to either version. I want to start my reviews with this book because it is one of the earliest Bible storybooks I found that is really aimed at young kids. This book wasn't in my initial survey, but it's the one that was most often mentioned by people who responded. Most of them especially commented on the beautiful pictures in the original version. There are many things to appreciate about this book. The language it uses is simple, and the questions it asks could probably be answered by most preschoolers. It also covers a broad swath of stories, including things like the cities of refuge from Numbers. I have to admire a children's book that includes any content from Numbers, and this one has quite a few stories based there. I haven't counted exactly, but this one may include as many stories from the Hebrew scriptures as any single volume storybook I've seen. It certainly includes some that are rarely, if ever, told. In the New Testament, it's significant for including quite a few parables and teachings of Jesus, and not just his actions or miracles. However, it does end with Acts. There's nothing from any of the epistles or Revelation included. In addition, the stories are of consistent lengths and include questions and a short prayer, making them easy to use for a regular devotional time. The pictures in this new version are colorful and pleasant, though not really remarkable. Some people who were familiar with the older version of this book miss the original pictures. The new pictures seem to be more specifically aimed at children. The author is probably better known as the author of the Living Bible, and it seems one of his main goals was to make the Bible more understandable to both adults and children. This book has been available in some form since 1956, and he authored other children's books as well, so there's a good chance that you've seen something by him. Because of its age and longevity, probably every other children's Bible storybook that you've seen has been impacted directly or indirectly by Kenneth N. and this book. I think that's worth appreciating. I think most Christians believe that it's important to teach the Bible to our children, but it's not always easy to figure out how. With this book, Taylor suggests a way and opened a path that others continue to follow. Many people have fond memories of this book, and I want to acknowledge that. That said, the book is imperfect. When I first flipped through it, I wasn't too bothered. But as I started reading the stories and spending time with the pictures, I found more and more things that irked me. At one point, I worked my way through it trying to take pictures of every page that I took issue with for my own notes. And I ended up taking pictures of almost every page. A lot of them are me being nitpicky. The rocks are the wrong color or shape. The plants are too tropical looking. The armor is a bit anachronistic. But other things are more concerning, like the lack of almost any variation in skin color or some of the more violent stories and pictures, accompanied by the implication that if you don't obey God, you might die like these people. I was also bothered by the lack of inclusion of women's stories. Sometimes, even when the story was included, the woman's name wasn't, like in the case of Rahab and Naomi. I think the thing that bothered me the most, though, is the tendency it has to make every story into a moral, as if the goal of the whole Bible is to make good little boys and girls who obey God and are kind, brave, honest, and hardworking. These aren't necessarily bad goals, but my concern is that it risks making the Bible into a sort of rule book. It flattens the stories to one dimension and cuts out a lot of the depth and richness that they should have. This concern was shared by several other reviewers. In summary, if you are looking for a book for young children that has stories of consistent lengths, that includes questions and prayers, and that introduces a broad swath of stories and characters, and you don't mind skipping the more violent ones or rewording some of the more moralistic teachings, this could work for you. I think we'll try to make a tier list of Bible storybooks. I'll put this one right in the middle to start with, though we may need to adjust that as we get more to compare it to, or possibly make separate lists for different ages, since realistically this would be an okay book for a 4-year-old, but pretty abysmal for most 10-year-olds. But here's our start. If that summary is enough information for you, feel free to stop here. I will put links in the description to a document with fully filled out rubric and other notes I made while looking at the book. If you want to know more of my thoughts or see some more specific examples, keep watching and we will work our way through the rubric and give a few more details, especially where geography and context are concerned. We'll start with illustrations. As I mentioned earlier, this version of the book was illustrated by Annabelle Spenceley. If you are curious about the illustrations in the older version, I will link to a YouTube playlist of Bill Pierce reading through it. But we'll talk about the newer illustrations here. Annabelle Spenceley is a fairly prolific illustrator. Goodreads shows around 30 different books that she has illustrated. In this book, I would guess she mainly used watercolor and colored pencils. The colors tend to be lighter and brighter with high saturation. I don't find most of the pictures terribly artistically compelling or memorable, but they are adequate for depicting the scene in the story. The style is somewhere between realistic and cartoonish. It seems fairly typical of Bible stories aimed at children. It is generally not graphically violent, but there are a couple stories where the words or pictures may depict more violence than may be appropriate for some children. For example, page 122, Safe in the City, depicts a man with a bloody axe running from another man with a knife. I also think Stephen Goes to Heaven on page 370 could be disturbing for some children. My major concern with the illustrations is the lack of diversity. Almost everyone has light tan skin. There's a little more diversity with hair color and texture, but in general, I would say that most people look more Southern European than Semitic. The illustrator does make some effort to differentiate Egyptian, Mesopotamian, and Ethiopian with skin, hair, and clothing choices, but pretty much everyone else is generically Bible bathrobe. A personal pet peeve of mine is how much blue and purple clothing there is. I'm not an expert on the history of dye, but I do know that blue and purple dyes tended to be rarer and therefore a marker of wealth. The blues and purples make for a bright and colorful book, but it feels a bit anachronistic to me. Some of the architectural and scenery details in the background are quite excellent. but others missed the mark. I think my favorite was from Jesus Cries About a City on page 304, which shows a pretty decent view of the temple and the Antonia fortress from the Mount of Olives. In terms of geography, geology, and ecology, I want to be fair, because they're definitely not the least accurate illustrations I've seen. But on the other hand, there are little things on most pages that are just off enough to bother me. In general, there's too much grass, but not enough shrubs, too many palm trees, and not enough oaks and olive trees. There are times it looks like a desert and should be greener, like the story of a man plants seeds on page 292. Why is this man planting seeds in a desert? And other times when it looks green and should be more barren, like the story of a shepherd finds his lost sheep on page 306. This is nothing like the typical areas where sheep would have been pastured. Rocks and soil are close enough to pass, but sometimes the wrong colors or shapes. Sometimes stones are dressed more neatly than I would expect of that era or place. In a few pictures, the style and color of the buildings, along with the prevalence of palm trees, makes it feel like it's somewhere tropical rather than the Middle East.
As I reflect on these sets of images side by side, I recognize that the differences might seem fairly insignificant, and maybe they are. Illustrations that are by nature limited in details will just never have the exact type of rock or foliage I might expect, and most people won't notice the difference. I think I mainly want to point out that even good illustrations will fail us at points, and we should be careful of how much we allow them to shape our imagination and therefore our theology.
There are a few other little things that I made note of, and if you're curious, you can check the links in the description, but we're going to move on to the text. The author, Kenneth N. Taylor, is a significant figure in Christian publishing. In addition to having several of his own books published, as part of the process of publishing his living Bible, he founded Tyndale Publishers, which is still a big name in Christian publishing today. He attended several Christian institutions of higher learning, including Wheaton and Dallas Theological Seminary. And according to Wikipedia, he attended College Church in Wheaton, which is in the, quote, broadly Reformed Congregationalist tradition. One of his main passions seems to have been making the Bible understandable for both adults and children, and he and Tyndale continue to have a significant impact on Christian children's literature. Like several of the Bible storybooks I've seen aimed at younger children, the intention here seems to be not so much to tell stories, but to introduce characters from the Bible with the goal of forming character within the children. It's not always explicit, but the message often seems to be brave like Joshua, or be kind like Ruth, without telling us much more about them or their stories. While I find this problematic in many ways, it does have the benefit of keeping the stories short enough so that many can be included, which can give a broader view of the Bible. I do appreciate that this storybook contains a lot of fairly unique stories, like scenes from Numbers and Jeremiah. I appreciate that it doesn't shy away from complicated or even violent stories. Those are part of the Bible, and they are important to talk about. That said, I don't really like how this book handles a lot of those more complicated stories. The short text doesn't allow much space for nuance, and the questions are aimed at reading comprehension, not deeper discussions. The lessons seem to end up being something like, these people didn't obey God. They are sad. They died. And there are a lot of ways such lessons could be harmful for a child, especially if given without discussion or nuance. There were several other smaller issues that bothered me as well. I was bothered by how many times the stories exclude the women in them or didn't mention their names. Miriam plays a significant role in Moses' life and the Exodus from Egypt, but her name was never mentioned. Esther's story isn't even included, which is rather unusual for Bible storybooks. Only 6 women are mentioned by name in the titles, and not that many more are mentioned in the stories. Of course, all Bible storybooks must make choices about what to include, but with the effort this one put in to include some of the less common stories, it almost feels like an effort was made to exclude women. Another smaller issue was that several of the stories were made up. For example, we know that Solomon worshipped other gods, but that was turned into a story about him praying to an idol with an accompanying picture of a man praying to a statue, which looks like an extra large Baal figurine. We also know that the cities of refuge were established in numbers, but the story of a man running to one with his bloody axe doesn't exist as such. This seems unnecessary. It's not that hard to write a paragraph about Solomon turning away from God without having to make up a story about him specifically praying to an idol. It's these sorts of things that make it feel like the motive of teaching kids a lesson was more important than staying true to the text. Lastly, I think if I were to use this book in addition to skipping or adding to some of the stories, I would probably specifically skip most of the prayers. A lot of the really moralistic nature of the book comes from the prayers, which often focus on obedience in some form. Lastly, let's talk about any additional practical considerations, other people's reviews, and anything else that might impact our view of this book. First, there are a couple of options for accessibility. There is an Internet Archive version available for people with print disabilities. And as mentioned before, there is a YouTube playlist with Bill Pierce reading through the older version of this book. If there is another audio version of the book, I haven't found it yet. Second, I did want to note that the author sometimes speaks in present tense, sometimes past, and sometimes future tense. I didn't find it terribly distracting, but for some people it may be. In addition, the language used is very simple, which might not be ideal for older children or, honestly, some parents. I did also look at reviews for the book on Amazon and Goodreads. Many people loved it, but many were also bothered by the occasional violence, the moralistic tone, or the lack of grace and connection to the gospel. Several people mentioned they missed the pictures from the older version. Some people mentioned its simplicity and had a plan to move on to a book aimed at older children like Eggemeyer's Bible Storybook, so we'll try to review that one at some point. My hope is that our consideration of this book, one of the first of its kind, will give us a baseline as we go on to consider other Bible storybooks. Hopefully this has been a helpful discussion to have. I realize I haven't covered all the questions within the rubric, like, is Jesus pictured? Yes. Or what pronouns are used for God? Mainly masculine. But those sorts of answers will also be in the rubric in the link below. So if you have a specific question that I didn't talk about here, chances are good I put it in my notes somewhere, so you can go look at that. And if not, feel free to post a question here and I will try to answer it. Hopefully this has been helpful information, and I do hope it will give us something to compare to as we move forward. Thank you so much for watching. I will be back soon with a new Bible storybook to examine, and I will see you then.